Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sheriff Ron Spike, Chairman of the Municipal Police Training Council. Welcome. We will have a Pledge of Allegiance led by Dr. McBride. After that pledge, we will have a moment of silence for the incident in Uvalde recently. The fact that we just had Memorial Day and honor those served in our country and lost their life, and honoring those that lost their life in law enforcement. Doctor?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
If I could, Sheriff, I'm sure we also wanted to, have a moment for the people in Buffalo. I think we would.
Oh, yes, yes. Thank you, Joanna. Another moment of silence, please, for the tragic incident in Buffalo, New York. Thank you. Well, let me welcome everyone here today, and we've got some new members here, and we certainly welcome the recently retired Chief of Police from Yonkers, John Mueller. I welcome him to the council. We welcome Mike Cassidy from the New York City Police Department. Thank you for being here. And we have another new member on the video, Sheriff Toulon from Suffolk County, I believe is on the video. Okay.
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And so forth. So we have a couple of action items and several other things to discuss today. We have the potential for an executive session as well as we get into our work. Let's go around the room and introduce ourselves for the record, and start from my left.
Bruce McBride, Commissioner of Police, when he retired.
Tim Parisi, Chief for the Ilion Police Department, representing the New York State Association of Chiefs of Police.
Inspector Michael Cassidy, New York City Police Department.
Natasha Harvin-Locklear, DCJS Legal.
Johanna Sullivan, DCJS, Office of Public Safety.
Molly Bates, DCJS, Office of Public Safety, Law Enforcement Training.
Chris Farina, DCJS, Office of Public Safety, Missing Persons Clearinghouse.
Joshua Vinehout, Office of Public Safety at DCGS.
Dan Edwell, Office of Public Safety, Law Enforcement Training.
Colleen Glavin, DCJS, Office of Legal Services.
Joe Popkin, Executive Deputy Commissioner at DCJS.
John Mueller, retired Yonkers Police Commissioner as of 30 days ago. I'll be starting my new job as the Chief of the Metropolitan Transit Authority Police on June 17th.
Congratulations.
Congrats. Ed Kennedy, State Police, Deputy Superintendent, Employee Relations.
Okay.
Brian Garvey, DCJS Legal.
Brian?
Public Safety.
Thank you.
Gabe Maruso, Office of Public Safety, DCJS.
Sarah Dean, Office of Public Safety, DCJS.
Sure.
Kelly Conlon, Office of Public Safety, DCJS.
Mike Puckett, DCJS, Office of Public Safety.
Mike?
John McElwain, New York State Police Academy.
John Durrow, New York State Police Academy.
Thank you. Okay, welcome all. Thank you. The chair.
I'm sorry, did you get the individuals on?
Oh, yes, okay. Maureen, are you on there?
Yes, hi, I'm Maureen Curtis, Vice President of Criminal Justice Programs for Safe Horizon in New York City.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Commissioner Rosado, are you there? Or Commissioner Rosado, excuse me.
Yes, I am. Good morning. Rosanna Rosado, DCJS.
Yeah, thank you. And Sheriff Toulon.
Hi, good morning. Errol Toulon, Sheriff of Suffolk County.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? that it, Josh, or?
Who's active participants in the meeting? yes.
Okay, all right then. All right then, keep me on track, folks, thank you. All right, well, the chair notes that there is a quorum present, and we thank you for that. The first order of business will be to adopt the agenda for this meeting. It's the 258th meeting that's before you, and I would entertain a motion to adopt that agenda.
So moved.
And do I hear a second?
Second.
A second. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same.
Aye.
All right, the agenda has been adopted. We thank you. The what was sent out to you was the 257th minutes from the meeting this spring, and I would entertain a motion to accept those minutes unless there are some corrections.
Motion.
A motion by Chief Parisi, second.
Second.
Second. Any further discussion? Okay, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, the 257th minutes are hereby approved as well. Commissioner Rosado, did you have some remarks you'd like to make?
Yes, very briefly. Thank you, Chairman Spike, and good morning to everyone. Good to be with you remotely today. It's hard to believe it's gone by so fast, but Memorial Day marked my 6-month anniversary at the agency, so I can no longer claim to be new, but I continue to learn every day, and I can share that I continue to be impressed by the depth and breadth of expertise and professionalism within the agency, particularly within our Office of Public Safety. Over the last few weeks alone, the OPS team coordinated and held the Police Officer Memorial Remembrance Ceremony, honoring the memory and sacrifice of fallen officers, and the Missing Children's Day poster contest, raising public awareness about unresolved missing children's cases. I'm grateful for the assistance they provide to all aspects of the DCJS mission, including the support for the MPTC. As I shared last time, the Governor's State of the State agenda and budget, which was enacted in April, provided a significant increase in our resources, primarily to address pandemic-era gun violence. We're now working to deploy resources and strategies in 2 ways. The first is to bolster law enforcement's ability to stop the flow of illegal guns and solve gun crimes. The second is support community-based solutions for stronger neighborhoods and better opportunities for young people and families who have been most affected by violence. This work is critical to the success and safety of our state, especially in the wake of the Buffalo mass shooting. We have staff on the ground there right now. I'm grateful to all of you also for the work you do to keep New Yorkers safe. I look forward to sharing more updates with you about our work, especially as I continue to travel the state with my team to hear more about the needs within each specific community, and I hope to see some of you there. Thank you, Chairman Spike, for the time, and with that, I turn the agenda back to you for the next items.
Thank you, Commissioner, for your remarks. Much appreciated. Thank you. I would, before we get into some other action items, I would just say this to the council members. When it comes to making a motion, the DCGS staff has put together some specific language in the handouts that we've got as to what that motion wording should be. And I would ask that we follow those guidelines and use that wording when we actually read the motion and read it out loud. And Natasha will be happy with me.
Watching every move.
We've got the first order of business is the license plate reader model policy. Has had some minor update to it, and Dan Nedwell will present that. Dan?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the council. In March of 2021, the council approved some changes to the license plate reader model policy that included reducing the minimum retention period of all LPR data from 20 years to 1 year to be better consistent with best practices in data retention. As a result of this update, the New York State Archives, who are responsible for setting local government data retention schedules, amended the local government schedule LGS 1, schedule item 1241, which has to do with LPR data retention, from 20 years down to 1 year to align with the best practices set forth in the model policy. With these changes to the schedule, the LPR model policy has been amended to reference the updated LGS schedule item 1241 with a footnote on page 4 of the policy. Are there any questions?
No, I don't think so, Dan. Thank you. Any council members have any questions of Dan?
This seems more reasonable.
I would entertain a motion as in action item number 3. Commissioner Miller, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Would you make that motion?
Yeah, I'll make the motion.
Okay. Could you read that as it is in action item number 3, if you've got that with you?
I'm sorry, I was working off of here, so.
Oh, I'm sorry too. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
That's all right.
We go ahead, Dr. McBride.
Okay, the motion is to adopt the amendment made to the MPTC license plate reader model policy.
And a second, please. Second. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same. Okay, the license plate reader model policy is approved as updated. Thank you. Thank you, Ned. Dan? The next is the MPTC guidelines for police officers' psychological examinations. Josh Weinhaut, you're up.
Thank you, Chairman. And members of the council, good morning. Just to start off with a brief history of the evolution of the guidelines that are being proposed to the council for adoption. Back in 2009, this was one of the very first guidelines that the council took on, was the developing a guideline for agencies who were voluntarily conducting psychological exams for hiring police officer candidates. At the time, the council felt that there was a need to provide guidance to law enforcement in the proper procedures for conducting psychological exams, as well as selecting psychologists, guidance, and who is best to provide the psychological assessment. And it was shortly thereafter, there was probably about a year of discussion and meetings going back and forth. And in 2009, the council formally adopted what was at the time recommended guidelines for conducting police officer psychological exams. Fast forward to 2021, the Professional Policing Act amended executive law. Specifically, it amended Section 840, Subdivision 2, that required the council to establish psychological assessment minimum hiring standards. And many of you who were on the council at that time certainly recall the conversations of developing regulations in compliance with that statute, specifically regulations for conducting psychological exams. When those regulations were proposed to the council, in the background, DCJS, in collaboration with civil service and other agencies, state agencies, municipal police departments, as well as psychologists, referred back to the 2009 document that was adopted by the council as a guiding point for establishing psychological assessment regulations. And during that time in 2021, when we were developing the regulations for proposal to the council, which obviously were subsequently adopted later on, we ensured that the 2009 documents still remained with the current best practices. We're still in line with best practices of conducting a psychological exam. After discussions with multiple people, as well as psychologists who are in the business of conducting public safety psychological exams, it was determined that the document is still reflects best practices at the time. So much of the regulations that were adopted by the council were derived from that 2009 document. Fast forward now to today at 2022. As you all know, the psychological the regulations for psychological assessments for municipal agencies and anybody that is required per criminal procedure law to conduct psychological exams at the time of hiring a police officer candidate. Those guidelines, the regulations have been adopted by the council. So these guidelines now reflect much of the regulatory language. And in addition to that, it removes much of the language that was in the 2009 document that alluded to the psychological exam being voluntary. Obviously, as we know now, it's required from 80 agencies. So much of that language, kind of the opening paragraphs of that guideline document, we removed anything that referenced psychological exams as being a voluntary process, and referenced specifically and cited the regulatory requirements to conduct psychological exams. So I'll walk you through, I believe you all have this in your packets. I can walk you through at a high level of what the document covers. Certainly, at any point, stop me if you have questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Firstly, if you turn to page 4, well, beginning of page 1 provides obviously background of the change in the regulations and the statutory requirement for the MPTC to develop psychological guidelines. The document also then gets into the purpose of why the document exists, and then follows, consistent with other model policy format, the definitions that of certain language that's used throughout the document for reference when anyone's referring this document as a resource. On page 4, one point to bring out, it specifically, just like the regulations do, it identifies at what point the psychological assessment must be conducted in compliance with American Disabilities Act, which is to be done after conditional offer employment, but before the officer is hired. So starting out as far as the psychological assessment procedure for law enforcement to follow as a best practice document, is ensure, first of all, at the timing of the psychological exam, when it should be actually issued in compliance with the American Disabilities Act. Again, that's also reflected in the regulations as well. On page 5, it specifies exactly what the regulatory requirements are for conducting a psychological exam, what to screen for, the use of validated written tests, the requirement of a semi-structured interview process. Again, the semi-structured interview process is defined in the definition section, which will give agencies further guidance as to what a semi-structured interview should look like when a psychologist is conducting an assessment. And then it also covers the report, again, reflecting the regulations as well. The guidance document also covers the process for the psychologist or qualified psychiatrist to issue an assessment report based on their findings and recommendations. The document then gets into providing guidance to law enforcement on page 5 as well on selecting a qualified psychologist or psychiatrist, things to look for, things to, one, make sure that they're licensed in New York State to be practicing, as well as any public discipline notices. There's links to provide law enforcement where to look for that. And then there's guidance for law enforcement when selecting a psychologist or psychiatrist to have a discussion about their experience, look up their experience, understand their curriculum vitae and what that includes to determine the relevance, their experience in conducting public safety psychological assessments.
Josh, if I could just interject something for a second. There's some issue out there regarding whether this should be the chief of police or the sheriff's responsibility to pick who this psychologist is, or is it up to the Civil Service Commission of that particular entity to make that selection?
The regs require that the Civil Service Commission makes the final determination. However, the agency should be recommending the individual that they've worked with, because there has to be a discussion between the psychologist and the psychiatrist about the goals of the agency, to understand the agency's needs, what they're looking for, and to ensure that the individual doing the assessment fully understands the needs of the agency.
Okay.
So it has to be from like a civil service approved officer, but approved psychologist or psychiatrist, but then the department can choose from somebody who was approved. If that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah. Two-step. Thanks, Josh.
And then page 8 of the document, after it gets through things to consider when selecting a psychologist and things to look for and things to ask, the informed consent piece with a candidate. There should be informed consent with a candidate in terms of that the agency administering the test is the sole recipient of the evaluation results, and it's best practice to ensure that put language in the informed consent that the candidate's not able to review the test or the evaluation results. For example, if a candidate was not selected by a particular agency and then reviewed the evaluation results and then further is hired by a different agency, that candidate now knows how to lie basically to the psychologist because based on the report. So the best practice for an agency would to ensure that there's, when drafting the informed consent between the candidate and the agency, the psychologist doing the assessment, that there's language in there for consideration. Again, all this should be reviewed with the legal department as well, the agency. These aren't meant to be legal guidance, but best practices guidance. So at the end of the day, it's important for agencies, obviously, to be working with their legal counsel as well. But these are things to consider as best practices in terms of informed consent. The next piece of the process would be
I'm sorry, Jess, can I ask a quick question? This is Maureen. Regarding the informed consent, how long does the agency keep that on file if they don't hire a person? And the answer to this, do they?
I'm sorry, you broke off.
Yeah, Maureen, you broke up. It sounds like were you asking how do they keep a copy of the informed consent?
How long do they keep consent? And if they don't hire, would they shift another agency if the person moves elsewhere?
Maureen, I'm going to take an attempt at what I think you were asking, and then you can tell me if we got it right. I apologize, you broke up, but I think you were asking how do they keep track of the informed consent, and if they go to another agency, how do you keep track of that if they try to apply somewhere else and keep track of who they are? Am I getting that right, Maureen, that was your issue? So say they failed
and if they would even share it at all with another agency.
Oh, I don't think that would, the psychological is not something that, we recommend sharing. We do have other areas where, there's background checks and things like that you have a requirement to check with the previous agency that was employed by someone. But as far as psychological goes, that would be something that we wouldn't recommend. We do say in the guidelines whether or not, so say I did a psychological and I passed it, and I go to another agency, and that agency, I give consent to have that be used. You could do that within a year per best practices, because psychological exams are quite expensive, and according to the best practices, it's still valid within a year of taking it. So that type of thing would be, but it wouldn't be something that would be, that the one agency cannot share it with another one. That's not part of the pieces. That's where your concern is, that would be the person's psychological will be shared around. Right. That's not part of the model. The model is more if in fact they would do a psychological and that you would apply somewhere else later and you want to utilize that as you're applying, then you can, the candidate would be able to say that. Am I getting that right, Josh?
Well, yeah, the informed consent would have language that the sole recipient of the results and the holder of them is the agency that hired the psychologist to do the assessment.
But if the candidate went to another department, say they weren't hired and they wanted to go to another department and they wanted to be able to utilize that if they allowed for that consent to do it, could be utilized by another department within a year, as long as it was
within a year. The regs allow for that.
Exactly.
But there would have to be that communication between.
That's right. There'd have to be some sort of consent by the person being evaluated. So, does that address your concern, Maureen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Go ahead, Josh.
Still on page 8, the use of properly validated tests need to be used as well. So there's a body of tests that have been validated in the public safety psychological test world that have been properly validated in terms of the law enforcement job duties and tasks that are critical in terms of psychological assessments. So when selecting a psychologist, they should be well informed that the use of certain tests should be properly validated against law enforcement job tasks that are related to psychological exams. So the use of validated tests are a critical component of this, and there's numerous tests that have been properly validated across the country that are currently utilized. Moving to page 10. After a validated test is provided to the candidate, the exam is then interpreted by a qualified psychologist or psychiatrist. Again, the qualified psychologist or psychiatrist is defined in the guidelines as well as the regulations. An important component of this process, as we had discussion previously when the regulations were adopted, is for the qualified psychologist or psychiatrist to interview the candidate as well, that semi-structured interview. The semi-structured interview is utilized, which will allow the evaluator, should additional questions need to be asked based on the type of answers or responses that are being given. It allows the psychologist to deviate and follow the path of the answers that are being given to further, elicit, I guess, a more clear response based on the exam results. So, for instance, this is why a semi-structured interview is critically important. There is no foolproof perfect test. The example I gave last time when we were going over the psychological regulations, there might be a question on there, have you ever thought about suicide? Well, someone may answer yes to that, but the reason they may have thought of that is, maybe they're watching a TV show and they say, gosh, maybe I probably would never consider ever doing that. And the question would lead someone to believe that, that the individual may have suicidal ideations. Having a semi-structured interview, the psychologist is able to clarify that response. Otherwise, it would have been a red flag indicator if that interview process wasn't conducted. So, best practices is to conduct that semi-structured interview. Again, leave it formal with questions, and then allow the psychologist to then dig deeper based on the responses that are provided by the candidate. And then on page 11. The psychologist should issue a report on a rating or recommendation. With this report, though, the regs do allow the appointing authority the ability to consider all the available facts and then make a determination whether or not to select a candidate, even after a report is issued. So some psychologists may issue reports like a grading scale of A through C, and anything from A through C minus is still within that range of acceptable, but like a D and an F might be considered. This candidate might have problematic things and issues that need to be addressed. It might not be a good candidate for the job. So psychologists do use different rating scales, and that's, again, important to have that discussion with the psychologist to ensure that the agency and the psychologist are understanding each other's needs and determine also the best approach for issuing any rating or recommendation. Again, the final authority, the regs do allow the final authority to lie with the appointing agency, the appointing authority. So that's in a nutshell, high level of what this document contains. The major deviation from the older one was that really what we did, we took it to model the similar format that we've done for other model policies with the outlining. It was written more in a kind of a more of a white paper stylistic format. Again, we're going back to 2009 before the council started to take on more and more policies, and finally they evolved into a set format. So in terms of naming the policy, I would also like to propose that the MPTC consider naming this policy MPTC Guidelines for Police Officer Psychological Exams. Because it is a mix of hiring regulations that are mixed in throughout, that are absolute requirements, and then there's also best practices guidelines in there as well. So I know I've talked a lot, I've said a lot to chew on. Certainly, is there any other questions?
Any council member have any questions for Josh?
I do, Jim.
Go ahead, Tim.
So in order to be compliant with ADA, it has to be at the time of an offer for a job. Is that, the reason I say that is what we are finding in that people are on a list that may have taken psychological exams for other agencies and having been determined by multiple other agencies as not suitable for whatever reason. And then they remain on a different county list, and you wouldn't know that. In a similar scenario where all agencies in the county or surrounding counties use the same psychologist to do the background, it kind of turns into, you have a person that remains on a list that now has already, it's kind of a loophole. They've already not been suitable maybe for 2 or 3 other agencies, and now you have that person still on the list. Is anything going to change if you go back to a third psychology exam? And that's what I think, I've seen that instance myself. So how prevalent that is around the state, I'm not sure. But I think it creates a loophole of leaving people on lists that are already very minimal with people that the amount of people to choose from is significantly lower than it used to be. And now we're having, and again, civil service, the top 3 scores, and that person's in the top 3 and already, so I don't know how we address that, but or if the regulations even allow anything to address that, but I'm seeing that from our standpoint as problematic because if it's not, I wonder what would prohibit having that done during you're having a physical exam, you're having a medical exam, you're past the written exam, and now psychological is part of the civil service process where it's done there. And then if you're not suitable or if it changed, so I'm not familiar with that, but maybe.
Yeah, no, Tim, if I could just address it quickly. The issue with civil service and the list challenge, which is not only a psychological challenge, right? There's a lot of other background challenges. And we have been having ongoing conversations with civil service because when we went around the state to address the Professional Policing Act, the issue regarding, the concerns regarding the list and people staying on the list is definitely out there. We've heard it from a lot of people. We don't control that side of things, but we have been talking to civil service about ways in which, maybe we can talk with them about going out and doing some training on disqualifiers and working with the local civil service. Could we talk with them about making sure the local civil service understands the rules around disqualifiers and things like that? Because what we had been hearing was a lot of concerns about disparate application of when you disqualify someone,
Right,
when you
right.
don't disqualify someone, and a lot of chiefs understandably being challenged with that. We can't control that part of things, and we can't obviously change what the ADA and what laws like that. And that's going to be, just to clarify, and Josh said it too, that's a local determination. They should work with their own lawyers to do that kind of thing and decide when is it. But the conditional offer is always, and the medical is always after the conditional offer, as is this, now the psychological is in with that for the same reasons. So, we can't change those types of things, but we can, and we have been having ongoing conversations with civil service to see if there's ways in which we can maybe better educate on the disqualifier concerns.
Joanna, what if you were able to add that as part of the application process, to Tim's point, where you could say, have you on your entrance application, and when you're writing that, I guess it's, when you're preparing for the psych, the intake, saying, have you been disqualified?
Well, one of the things you could do, John, is we do have a background check piece in there. I'm just saying in the background check part of it that happens beforehand.
But the American Disability Act forbids, it classifies psychological assessments as a medical exam. And the American Disability Act forbids anybody prior to conditional job offer to be evaluated for any medical related issues. So if someone on part of the background investigation, which generally occurs prior to conditional job offer, if someone were to indicate that they've been, they failed a psychological exam, you're now violating the American Disabilities Act because they're revealing that the psychological exam is considered a medical exam.
So you can use the informed consent piece you have in here to say, you're basically signing that away, and not saying would necessarily disqualify one, but what it might do is you allow, through the informed consent, could you have that given to the appointing authority to have their psychologist look
But
at
I think a different way maybe to get at what you're trying to get at is more in the background check, have you applied for other police departments? And I don't think that would violate the American Disability Act. So Josh's point is valid, but you'd have to look at the background check because that happens beforehand, right? So if there's ways in which the issue that you're talking about, we can't violate that. We don't want to encourage that, of course, for understandable reasons. But if there's ways in which you can do background check and your investigator can do background check to find out, where else has this person applied? That's a normal kind of a background question. And what are the results? Those types of things I think would fit within a background check. But obviously you can't go into the psychological and all those reasons for the reasons that Josh talked about. So I think you can work with your own investigators to try to address the issue that you're seeing appropriately to get a better understanding. You want to understand who this person is that's applying for your job. So
I hadn't reviewed the ADA prior, so you answered my question. So really, to deviate from that would be a violation. So okay.
It gets very slippery because if the psychological assessment were to reveal what may be considered a medical issue, right now you haven't even gotten to the point of conditional job offer.
Right.
So you're on slippery slope with when in violation of the American Disabilities Act.
As Josh mentioned, always consult with your
Absolutely.
attorneys before you change anything.
From what I've seen around the state, obviously the civil service commissions are different in each jurisdiction on their opinion they take on this. But the ones that I've seen that have been successful in using 50.4 for a disqualification is the fact that they put it in the test announcement right up front that it could be a disqualifier. And those seem to be successful in using 50.4 to do a disqualification based upon this. But if it's not in that announcement in the test to start out with, you're not gonna get the 50.4 to work. That's that's my experience from talking to others.
Thanks, Ron. That's very helpful, and we can bring that back to civil service from what you're seeing, and if you can share that further with us, I think we can share that with them.
If it's in that original announcement that for the test, that's important language to have in there.
Yep.
Does anyone else have any concerns or questions, or anyone on the video have any concerns?
If I could, Chairman, I just want to say thanks to Josh for bringing this up. We've been getting a lot of questions, as you might imagine, since the regs went into effect and from the field. And I think this is going to be really useful to the field on the issue of psychological and how do you, and providing guidelines and guidance for that. So I think that's going to be really useful.
Have you had questions, Joanna or Josh, on foiling the results of one of these exams?
I have not.
No, I don't believe our staff on the administrative side has either.
Right.
No.
We've had that happen. We've turned it down, obviously, but
So in summary, this moves the psychological from a voluntary best practice to a mandatory, and also applies to full and part-time officers?
That's correct. So the regulations is the authority that requires the use of psychological exams. And this document is just reciting that authority as well as providing some best practice guidance.
Okay. And I think going forward, I mean, obviously, I think we would all agree that this is a good thing to do. But I think going forward, some issues that we've discussed might be to have a directory of who the qualified psychologists and psychiatrists are. I know that civil service entities in each county have working relationships, but it'd be nice to have a statewide, because somebody from, say, Oneida County may need somebody, and Madison County is looking for somebody. But yeah, I'm just thinking out loud. And the other thing, too, is it'd be nice to find out what instruments are being used. And the only reason I say that is some states have specific tests that must be used, but I know in New York we say you can do something that's invalidated. But when I ask the question to people, well, what exam are you using? I remember the old MMPI, and I know that's been updated, but I'm sure there's others that are out there.
There are, and speaking to the psychologists, a couple of individuals rattled off quite a few of them, and then each of them have the pros and cons. That's why the semi-structured interview is critical. I can certainly get the names of those that were brought up and share them with the council members.
Thank you.
I can't remember off the top of my head the specific names.
The other thing for the record here is that this applies to police officers. It does not apply to peace officers. Is that correct as far as these guidelines go? Many agencies that hire correction officers do use psychologicals as a pre-hiring issue. But these regulations apply to just police. Am I right on that, Josh?
Correct. Defined in Criminal Procedure Law 1.20, subdivision 34, and then there's specific paragraphs within that define who the agencies, these regulations apply to.
But Ron, if they were looking for guidance on choosing a psychologist and all that, they could utilize this, similar to this was in effect before the regs were in effect for those types of things. But yes, it's only mandated to police.
Okay. And then the final step here on the next slide, just what are the next steps? If the council were to approve the amendments made to this document, and our next steps would be one, in terms of transparency, we have other model policies that are posted on our public website. We would post this one on our public website as well for transparency. And also we've developed a frequently asked question document based on questions that have come in since the professional policing regulations have been issued. So at soon to be, we'll have a link in those FAQs that also link to this guideline document as a further resource. So not only are there frequently asked questions related to the Professional Policing Act and the hiring standards, but then there'll also be a link that directs to this document too for psychological assessments.
Okay. Good. Any further concerns or questions?
I have one concern.
Go ahead, Mike.
Select a psychologist. It says in page 8, select a psychologist should assist law enforcement in maintaining adverse impact analysis to detect any discriminatory patterns of psychological testing program. Was there any concern of having the EO officer partake in that analysis as well? Or the DNI officer of that particular agency?
It wasn't considered, but I don't see why not.
You could amend it to reflect. Just that it would be, best practice would be work with your.
Yeah, keep them in the loop as part of the process. Some recommendations can be made to the agency head if they see a pattern of discriminatory practice that can be rectified.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Thank you for the suggestion.
What's the subsection we'd add that to?
If I'm hearing you correctly.
It's page 8, looks like.
Very top.
Right at the top of the page.
E2.
E2.
Okay.
Just be something that, and work in conjunction with the affirmative,
Yeah, whatever the proper title is, yes.
affirmative action officer or
similar title.
similar title.
Something like that.
EE officer, DNI officer.
Station with the agency is designated DNI.
Yep. Thank you for that suggestion.
Thank you.
Okay, any further concerns or? All right. The motion is up on the teleprompter there. If we would have to just, when we make this a motion, we'd have to add your terminology there, amendment, Mike. You want to go ahead with that,
You made the motion?
Yeah.
Okay. Motion to adopt the amended PTC guidelines for police officer psychological exams. An amendment to page 8. Top of the page, subdivision E2.
Yep.
The selected psychologist should assist the law enforcement agency in maintaining an adverse impact analysis to detect any discriminatory pattern of psychological testing program. It's recommended that the DNI officer, EE officer, or affirmative action officer or equivalent be part of that decision-making process.
Okay, thank you. Are we okay with that motion?
Yes,
All
perfect.
right, do I hear a second?
Second.
Any further discussion or questions? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same. Okay, I don't hear any opposition, so, okay, thank you, Michael. And that motion is approved, and we go forward. Okay, now we're going to move to informational update items. We got several of them. First, Natasha will go over the professional policing regulation updates. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. Members of the council, just to give you an update that the regulations have been submitted for another round of emergency adoptions. We actually finished our review with civil service. So I'm just going to go through their comments right now. We have a meeting later on today, actually. So hopefully this will be the last. We can finally get these adopted permanently.
That's it?
That's it.
That was very short.
And when we release those, we're going to release those in conjunction with the FAQs that Josh was talking about, because we've gotten so many, questions for that, so.
All right. Next, we have the jail time calculations, training course updates from Molly Bates. And this is, for those of us that are in corrections, this is such an important course. And these things take a double master degree to figure out sometimes. I tell you, there's a lot of contention with this type of thing, so it's very important. So Molly, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman and members of the council. This morning, I'd like to share a brief update on the jail time credit and calculations course. As a little background, Executive Law 840 grants authority to the MPTC to establish minimum training standards for local corrections officers. As part of this authority, the MPTC adopted the 13-hour jail time credit and calculation course in September 2011 and serves as a minimum training standard for local correction staff assigned to the task of calculating jail time credit and determining the sentences of inmates. DCJS staff, with the assistance of subject matter experts, recently conducted a review and update of these materials. And the updates include, in section 3, there's updates to the definition of 1 year based on changes to penal law section 7015 sub 1A. A year is now defined as 364 days for misdemeanor sentences and 365 days for felony offenses. Scenarios impacted, throughout the course there's scenarios, so the students are learning, how to calculate this. So any scenarios that were impacted by this change were updated throughout the curriculum, and new scenarios were added to address a recent situation where inmates were sentenced to 2 6-month sentences. So it addresses the 364 versus 365 days. Case law examples provided in the current curriculum were expanded for better understanding and are provided in their entirety in the appendices. The course materials and handouts were condensed. We found when we conducted the training that there was 5 or 6 different handouts and students were only using like 1 or 2. So we condensed that to make it easier for everyone. And 3 challenges were added to test student learning. So in the materials, the scenarios are written out in sentence form. In these challenges, we did mock commitment forms, sentences and stuff that they would see from the courts. Instead of having it read out in sentences, they just are given a packet and have to figure it all out, because that's what they get when they're back at their jail. All training topics, hours, and objectives remain the same. We do plan to offer more of this course later in our fiscal year. And anyone who completes this course can serve as an instructor, providing they have a valid general topic certification. Same as it always been. So,
okay. Okay, thank you. Any concerns or questions from anyone? Okay, thank you, Molly. Next is the unmanned aerial vehicle model policy update that being worked on. Christopher?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, other members of council, for having me here today. During the June 2016 MPTC meeting, the unmanned aerial vehicle, or UAV model policy, was presented and adopted by the council. The UAV model policy is intended to provide personnel associated with the deployment and use of UAVs with guidelines for proper usage of these vehicles and the retrieval and dissemination of any digital evidence or DME captured by the UAVs. The policy also has guidelines to minimize risk to law enforcement personnel, the public and property during the operation of UAVs, while protecting the rights and privacies of the citizens. Since 2016, the technology of the UAVs, as well as the regulations that govern the use of UAVs, has evolved. Therefore, OPS staff, with the assistance from key stakeholders, will conduct a thorough review of the model policy and bring forth any proposed amendments for the council's consideration and adoption at a future meeting. Any questions?
So the UAVs, a lot of departments have adopted those, and it continues to increase. Do you have an idea of what the substantive issues that you may have to address are?
I put a feeler out to some subject experts out in the field, including those with the FAA. And there are some training aspects that were not included in the original 2016 draft policy of that, which included the Part 107A for the pilot's certification and licensing to actually operate the UAVs. So that was one major part of it that in 2016 that has not been added as of yet.
Okay.
Do you see this coming forward for September's meeting?
Maybe not September, maybe further after that, maybe the December meeting or sometime around there.
Okay.
That's what I expect. We're in the process right now of putting together a panel to actually go ahead and have the policy reviewed by stakeholders and experts.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or concerns?
I think a big piece of the drone is, to your question, there's public opposition, like a lot. And I think a lot of it is that we're not explaining properly what the technology does and what the technology does not do. So the outreach piece is huge, to be able to explain to people and get, localized stakeholders to get involved so they can help write the policy. If you look at some of the, not so much New York State, but nationally, like Chula Vista, California, they have a great model policy. They use it like crazy, and they actually post every single flight on their website for the purpose of transparency. So I think what we found is the biggest roadblock is that there is a very, very vocal minority that is really opposed to this in any shape or form. But then when you kind of flip it around, you say, well, you're thinking in terms of investigative or maybe an overreach of authority as opposed to rescue, or there's an autistic child missing or someone who's an Alzheimer's patient. So I think a lot of the piece that you're going to want to work on is how to engage everybody in best practice ways to engage localized communities to get them to buy in.
Thanks for the suggestion.
That's a very good point, John.
And I'll just say it, I mean, certain conflict going on right now. UAVs are being used, and people are going to be saying, are the police arming these things, and all kinds of craziness. So.
Yeah, and that's what comes up. I mean, the discussion we've had, we've tried to be as transparent as possible, is, it's just the way it is. To your point, they want to talk about Israel and Palestine. And it's like, we're not Israel and we're not Palestine, and this isn't a Palestinian conflict. It's a local police department wanting that if an elderly person has Alzheimer's and escapes into the woods, we want to be able to get this thing up in the air, use thermal imagery to find them before they get hypothermia.
Right.
And when you put it in that context, I think they're more willing to have that conversation. But you're thinking, and this is what that group is thinking, is that it's going to be weaponized, there'll be guns on it, all kinds of different things. And, and obviously I don't think there's a single police department in New York State that wants that to happen. No. And it won't happen. It's just we have to get that message out.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important part to include in the policies, making sure that there's a piece about communication and how you convey the utility. You hit the nail on the head. Chris is with the Missing Person Clearinghouse. This came up as a result of us wanting to think about better ways in which we can source departments, because it's been so helpful in missing person cases. And so that's exactly the utility that we see primarily it being used for. But I think, informing people best and making sure that that's somehow a part of the policy is a really good point, though. Thank you.
The use case is also for officer wellness if you're doing accident reconstruction, versus having somebody out there physically.
And that's where we just tend to use ours the most, is accident reconstruction, to be honest with you. Yeah.
DOT's been using them a lot too. Yeah. Similar purposes.
Even for officer safety and suspect safety. I mean, there's a vehicle pursuit and someone's identified through a drone in the woods. You don't have to send officers rushing in right away. We can take our time, and we always know the time is helps us, and it makes everybody safer. So situations like that too is very valuable.
Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. All right. Thank you. Good discussion. Thank you, Chris. Next is the child abuse reporting and investigative procedures model policy that being developed and worked on. Josh?
Good morning again. Just a brief update similar to Chris's update. Executive Law 840, Subdivision 1, Paragraph J, requires the council to develop a model policy on reporting of child abuse and neglect. It references social services law and the mandatory reporting of certain provisions that are in there that are required reporters, mandatory reporters. So the DCGS staff will put together a subject matter expert panel to draft a model policy on child abuse and neglect that would follow the social service law. It would cover those items that appear on the screen that are specifically referenced in the statute requiring the council to develop this model policy. In addition, it requires training component to it on mandatory reporting. Office of Child and Family Services already has a detailed online training for mandatory reporters that we'll be able to leverage. In addition to, we also have in the past, I know Dan worked on it,
Child abuse investigations online training.
Right. Thank you for that. I was drawing a blank on the name. An online training for first responders to handle child abuse investigation training calls to minimize the impact by just gaining the minimal facts that are necessary and then referring them to a forensic interviewer, working hand in hand with child advocacy centers to conduct a further investigation. So we do have training components on child abuse as well, in addition to the mandatory retraining that we'll be able to reference in the model policy. And then the second piece, as you all may be aware of, the Family Court Act has been amended to change the definition of a juvenile delinquent. The age has been increased from 7 to 12 for a juvenile delinquent. So the amendment to the executive law charges the council to develop juvenile law training, and specifically to address the change in the juvenile law, juvenile delinquent definition, the age of being increased from 7 to 12, and then what an officer is to do with a child under the age of 12 that may commit an offense that would typically appear in front of Family Court Act, but now because of the new definition of juvenile delinquent, the process to be done for a child under the age of 12. And that amendment to the juvenile delinquent definition takes effect December 29th of this year. I've been already working with Office of Children and Family Services because it's their regulations that will define, it's called the Differential Treatment Response Program that OCFS has drafted regulations for on handling of a child under the age of 12. It's a voluntary program that the local social services districts will develop and under the guidance of the regulatory requirements for OCFS. And we'll be working with OCFS to inform law enforcement of what that process looks like for a child under the age of 12 and provide that in the training program to give them guidance on how to handle a call for a child under the age of 12 that no longer would any crime committed by them would no longer appear in front of family court because of the change in juvenile delinquent definition. So we'll be collaborating with stakeholders to develop that model policy and related training that's specific to executive law. And, either, again, September or December meeting, similar to the UAV model policy, we'll be presenting that to the council. Any questions on that?
Is there a timetable for this?
Yeah, December 29th is when the law takes effect. So obviously our meetings are quarterly, beginning the first week of the month. So if we were to provide it to the council by December, we'll be in a position to have a guidance in compliance with the law.
Thank you.
Okay. This is going to probably affect the basic course for police as well.
Yes, we'll have to update the basic course as well to reflect the new juvenile law, or juvenile delinquent definition.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions or concerns? Okay. Thank you, Josh. All right. We'll move into new business. There's going to be a discussion regarding the physical fitness job task. I'm going to make the motion that pursuant to New York State Public Officers Law, Article 7, Section 105, that we go into executive session, and that I would ask the director of OPS to select the non-MPTC members required to be here for this discussion that's essential. And that would be my motion. I would ask for a second.
I'm sorry, Chairman, could you read it exactly as it's? I'm sorry.
But you wanted like it says in here?
Yes.
Motion to enter an executive session to discuss confidential information pertaining to the preparation of and administration of a job task analysis examination questionnaire.
And that's it. And then what you said about her.
Yes, well, we go back to that. I'd ask the director to decide what non-members can be present.
Yes, and I'm going to defer to Josh, but I think we'd like to have Josh and certain members of our OPS staff that have been involved helping Josh. So Josh and I believe Dan and Mike are going to be in attendance. Is that correct, Josh?
I would welcome Sarah if.
And Sarah also, and I think we had a few members and legal coming there too. And we also had, I think, a few members from the state police that were going to be, they're going to be coming to the laughter one. Yep. So just Office of Legal Services, Brian, Colleen, and Sarah from our office, and Dan and Mike Puckett, myself, obviously the commissioner, and the executive commissioner Popkin.
And Betty.
And Betty.
All right.
Betty was hoping she was going to be out of that meeting.
All right, thank you.
I didn't realize it was going to be the one that was like asked to do this. I'm like, I would have had a whole list.